Hey, I'm Austin, and today on Animal Quests, I've gathered some of the most quietly devastating wildlife incidents ever documented. From a Kenyan riverbank, where a wildlife photographer stepped out of a vehicle for 30 seconds, to a flooded channel in Zimbabwe, where a current made a decision nobody in the water could reverse. But first, we begin on the Kenyan savanna, where a wildlife photographer went to a riverbank where a crocodile was already waiting. It was July 18, 2016. The dry season heat pressed down on the Kenyan savanna, and the air above the river corridor carried the thick, organic smell of thousands of animals compressed into a narrow migration route. The river ran brown and completely opaque under a midday sun, its surface broken constantly by the churning passage of wildebeest and zebra in numbers that stretched beyond the visible horizon. The muddy banks along the most heavily used crossing points had been destabilized by weeks of continuous animal traffic, and the ground at the water's edge was saturated beyond any structural reliability. I have stood at crossings like this one. The scale of it does something to your perception. The sheer volume of movement makes the water feel alive in a way that has nothing to do with what is underneath it. Daniel Mercer was a 41-year-old wildlife photographer from the United Kingdom, whose work had appeared in independent natural history publications and private gallery exhibitions across Europe. He had traveled to Kenya specifically to document the wildebeest migration crossing, a sequence considered among the most dramatic wildlife spectacles on the continent. Mercer had invested significant time and resources into the trip, booking a premium safari vehicle with exclusive access to the most active crossing zones along the river. His wife, Claire, 38, accompanied him as a general tourist with a long-standing interest in African wildlife. Their assigned guide, Elias Njoroge, 33, had worked the migration season for over a decade and held a thorough understanding of how the river behaved during peak crossing activity and the specific risks it carried. That combination, a photographer chasing a sequence, a guide who knows exactly what the water holds, is one I have seen produce tension before the incident even begins. The vehicle had positioned near a well-used crossing point, where thousands of animals had been moving upstream for hours, churning the riverbed sediment into an impenetrable brown suspension. Visibility below the surface was non-existent. Several crossing attempts had formed and dissolved over the preceding hours without producing the dramatic sequences Mercer had been pursuing. The longer a group holds position at an active crossing zone, the more the sequence builds. Animals compressing at the near bank, the noise rising, the water surface breaking in patterns that signal an imminent mass crossing. That accumulation has weight. Hours of waiting for a single sequence produces a specific kind of pressure in photographers, and that pressure has a documented history of producing movement toward the subject at the exact moment stillness is most critical. The shot had not arrived, and the light was beginning to shift in the way it does over the river in the middle hours, flattening the contrast that makes migration footage worth the cost of the trip. As a smaller group of wildebeest began compressing near the near bank, Mercer indicated he wanted to reposition closer to the slope to achieve a lower camera angle. The guide refused the request and pointed specifically to the muddy overhanging ledge at the bank's edge, noting that crocodiles routinely remain motionless directly beneath those margins during migration periods, invisible from any angle above the surface. The vehicle remained idling at its current position. Mercer exited the vehicle independently. His intention, based on accounts provided by those present, was to stabilize his camera against the muddy incline for only a brief period. The riverbank gave way beneath one leg almost immediately upon contact, sliding him down the collapsing edge into the deeper margin beside the crossing drop-off. The guide had named the exact location. That detail has stayed with me. Nile crocodiles are among the most effective ambush predators on the African continent. Adult males can exceed 16 feet in length and weigh over 1,500 pounds. They are capable of remaining completely motionless beneath murky water for extended periods, often positioned along precisely the kind of soft bank margins that border active animal crossing points. Their attack is not a pursuit. It is a transition from zero movement to full engagement in a fraction of a second, initiated at distances so close that the strike is complete before the human nervous system can initiate a withdrawal response. A crocodile's jaws generate one of the most powerful bite forces of any living animal, and once contact is established, the animal immediately initiates a rolling maneuver designed to disorient and submerge prey against any resistance. In the river during migration season, large crocodiles gather in significant numbers below crossing zones, conditioned by decades of annual prey concentration. The crocodile had been positioned less than 2 meters from where the bank collapsed. The strike came before anyone inside the vehicle had time to move. The animal engaged from the water below the drop-off and began pulling immediately toward deeper current, initiating the rotational behavior characteristic of a crocodile working against resistance. The guide grabbed a vehicle recovery strap and braced against the doorframe in an attempt to create counter-tension, while Claire initiated emergency radio contact with the wider safari network operating in the area. The crocodile continued rotating, pulling toward the deeper central channel. Mercer did not survive the water. The subsequent investigation confirmed that he had exited the vehicle in direct contravention of the guide's explicit instruction and had entered the water at the precise location the guide had identified as dangerous. The guide and the operating company were cleared of any responsibility. The operator reviewed its vehicle protocols for active crossing zones following the conclusion of the investigation. The instruction existed, the warning was given. The rule that came after was written around the shape of what had already happened. The river takes what it wants without hesitation. The bush is slower about it, but the outcome is the same. It was September 3, 2019. The late dry season in a game reserve in western Zambia had stripped the bush to its minimum. The vegetation was a compressed tangle of gray thorn scrub and dust-covered elephant paths, dense enough in places to reduce sight lines to under 10 meters. The air was still and dry, carrying scent further than usual, and the ground around a shrinking water source nearby was layered with fresh tracks from every major species in the region. The conditions were exactly those in which experienced guides exercise the most caution. I think that is worth holding on to. The conditions themselves were a warning, and the guide read every part of them correctly. Michael Torres was a 52-year-old retired professional from the United States who had dedicated a substantial portion of his retirement to international wildlife travel. He had participated in guided safaris across multiple African countries over the preceding years and considered himself a practiced and comfortable participant in bushwalking activities. His traveling companion, Naomi Reed, 48, a committed wildlife enthusiast from the same country, had selected the walking component of the itinerary, specifically for the close-range nature experience it offered. Their guide, Patrick Zulu, 44, had led walking safaris in the reserve for over 15 years, carried a legally licensed firearm as required for all guides operating on foot in areas with dangerous game, and was regarded as one of the more experienced practitioners in the region. Walking safari guiding carries a category of responsibility that has no direct equivalent in vehicle-based operations. A game drive vehicle functions as a physical and olfactory barrier between guests and the surrounding wildlife. Animals that would respond aggressively to a human figure on foot often treat a stationary vehicle as a neutral feature of the landscape. On foot, that barrier is absent entirely. What replaces it is the guide's continuous environmental assessment: track age, scent direction, bird behavior, vegetation density, wind shift. The reserve's walking program operated on the strength of that assessment, and the guests behind Zulu on any given morning were entirely dependent on it functioning without interruption. The group moved through dense brush along an elephant path toward the water source. Within a short distance, the guide identified a sequence of environmental warning indicators arriving in close succession. Fresh buffalo dung with insect activity still present on the surface, a small group of oxpeckers lifting suddenly and without apparent cause from low vegetation ahead, and the heavy livestock-like musk of buffalo drifting through the still air from a direction that placed animals nearby. He directed the group to close their spacing immediately and begin a controlled backward withdrawal from the area. Torres, who had drifted slightly to one side while attempting to photograph movement in the scrub, stepped off the designated path and partially separated his position from the rest of the group. A few meters, that is all it was. In that bush, at that moment, it was enough. A solitary old buffalo bull had been resting in the shade of dense cover at close range. The animal came out of concealment without an extended approach warning. The distance between the bull and the group at the moment of the charge was short enough that the guide had time only to raise his voice before contact occurred. African buffalo are consistently listed among the most dangerous animals on the continent, and for reasons that are frequently underestimated by those encountering them for the first time. Solitary old bulls, animals that have been expelled from the main herd and spend their days resting in thick cover, are specifically more dangerous than herd animals, exhibiting a pronounced aggression that experienced guides treat with more caution than almost any other buffalo encounter type. An adult bull can exceed 1,500 pounds and carries horns that fuse at the skull base into a solid bone mass, capable of delivering impacts that fracture vehicle bodywork. A charging buffalo uses its horns to hook, toss, and pin rather than simply to ram, and animals that charge from concealment at close range leave almost no margin for any protective response. They are also documented to double back and re-engage after an initial charge, a behavior that makes the period immediately following impact as dangerous as the impact itself. That last detail is the one guides fear most. The first charge ends the encounter for most animals. The buffalo sometimes comes back. The animal went straight to him and drove him into thorn scrub before veering back into heavy vegetation. The guide discharged a warning shot only after the initial impact, consistent with standard protocol in close-range encounters where firing before contact risks redirecting the charge direction in a way that cannot be controlled. Torres sustained puncture and blunt force injuries. The group was extracted from the area under the guide's direction. Emergency protocols were activated at the nearest vehicle access point. The investigation confirmed that Torres had separated from the group against the guide's instruction during an active withdrawal in an area where multiple clear warning indicators were present and had been acknowledged by the guide in real time. The guide was cleared of any negligence. The reserve reviewed its pre-walk briefing protocols with specific attention to group spacing management in dense vegetation sections following the conclusion of the investigation. Torres stepped off the path. What comes next didn't require open ground or daylight. It only required dark and a smell that shouldn't have been there. It was November 11th, 2014. The dry season in northern Botswana had drawn the seasonal floodplains down to cracked margins, and the night air across the delta carried the deep silence that settles over the African bush when no wind moves through the scrub. Temperatures dropped sharply after dark, and the camp sat beside dried floodplain channels that, in wet years, carried water through the area, but in the dry months served as natural movement corridors for every large animal in the region. The camp had no perimeter fencing. This was by design. I find that detail unsettling every time I return to it, not because it was wrong, but because it was honest. The camp existed inside the bush, not beside it. Rachel Kim was a 29-year-old travel blogger based in the United States whose platform focused on immersive wildlife and adventure travel experiences. She had built a following through a combination of high-quality field photography and detailed written accounts of remote destinations, and she approached each assignment with the dual perspective of participant and content producer. Her traveling companion, Sophie Lang, 31, worked as a professional photographer and had accompanied her on multiple previous international assignments. The camp manager, Kabalo Moeti, 37, had operated the property for several years and held a detailed working knowledge of the local wildlife patterns, particularly the seasonal movement of large predators and scavengers through the camp area during dry months when food sources became concentrated. During the evening meal, Kim retained a portion of grilled meat, wrapping it and keeping it inside her tent after returning for the night. The camp's standing instructions to all guests, issued at check-in and repeated before each evening, were explicit. No food items of any kind were to be carried into sleeping tents, and nothing edible was to be removed from the communal dining area and taken outside after dark. The reason for this instruction was well established by the camp's operational history. Spotted hyenas in the surrounding area had developed a persistent association between the camp and food odors across multiple dry seasons, and their nightly movement through the tent line was a routine occurrence that staff managed through strict odor control. The instruction was not precautionary, it was operational. There is a difference, and camps like this one know it. Unfenced camps operating inside active wildlife areas function on a system of behavioral controls that substitutes for the physical barrier a fence would provide. Every protocol exists as a component of that system, and the system holds only when every component holds simultaneously. Camps that operate this way typically run without incident across multiple seasons, which can produce a gradual normalization of the rules among guests who have followed them before without consequence. The rules feel precautionary after enough uneventful nights. They are not precautionary. They are the reason the nights were uneventful. At approximately 2 a.m., sounds outside the tent registered as movement nearby. Kim exited the tent, carrying the wrapped meat, with the intention of depositing it near the communal area. Multiple hyenas were already moving through the space between the tents. The animals had been drawn by the concentrated food scent before she had opened the tent door. Spotted hyenas are among the most ecologically successful large carnivores in sub-Saharan Africa, a classification that surprises many visitors who assume they operate primarily as scavengers. Adult hyenas weigh between 90 and 190 pounds and possess the strongest bite force relative to body size of any African carnivore, sufficient to crush large bone entirely. Their intelligence, social coordination, and adaptability make them highly effective at exploiting human environments. and animals that become food conditioned around camps develop a persistence and directional boldness that escalates significantly when direct food access appears possible. In camp settings, hyena incidents rarely begin as predatory attacks. They begin as opportunistic food-seeking behavior and can escalate sharply when a human drops below upright height, the silhouette these animals are instinctively cautious of, or when food contacts the ground near a position where multiple animals are already competing for access. One animal approached from the front as Kim retreated toward the lit pathway between structures. A second had circled to a position behind her. When she slipped on loose sand near a drainage edge, the wrapped meat fell from her hands to the ground directly beside her. The sudden drop in her body position, combined with the immediate presence of food at ground level, produced a rapid escalation in the surrounding animals' behavior, triggering competing scavenging responses among the group. That sequence, the slip, the drop, the height change, happened in under 2 seconds. The animals were already there, the variables just aligned. Camp staff responded with vehicle floodlights, sustained engine noise, and coordinated shouting from multiple positions, dispersing the animals before physical contact occurred. Kim sustained minor injuries consistent with the fall itself. The camp conducted a full review of its food storage enforcement and guest briefing procedures in the days following the incident. Kim walked out to fix a mistake the next person never made. 1. The animal charged anyway. It was May 26, 2017. The late afternoon light over a national park in northern Botswana fell long and low across the riverside plain, the kind of golden hour light that draws safari vehicles into position hours before peak activity and creates strong incentives to remain stationary, well past the point where guides begin to grow uncomfortable. The heat had begun to drop, and large numbers of elephants were moving from inland feeding areas toward the river in the well-established late-afternoon corridor pattern that the park's experienced operators knew as a fixed daily certainty. The light at that hour is extraordinary. It is also the reason vehicles stay too long and position too close. Beauty has a cost in places like this. Johan Venter was a 46-year-old safari driver from South Africa who had worked across multiple game reserves on the subcontinent and held a professional guide qualification with dangerous game endorsement. Emily Carter, 25, and Lucas Meyer, 27, were tourists from different countries who had joined a shared vehicle for the afternoon drive. The riverside track through this section of the park was a narrow single-lane road bordered on one side by dense riparian vegetation and on the other by a drainage ditch, used daily by breeding herds moving between the interior bush and the water. It was not a road designed to accommodate multiple stopped vehicles simultaneously. Several vehicles had gathered along the track during the late afternoon movement, and one positioned ahead had stopped awkwardly in a location that partially blocked passage through the corridor. Tourists across multiple vehicles had risen through roof hatches as a breeding herd began emerging from tree cover. Venter observed the nearest female displaying a clear and escalating sequence of stress indicators. Ears held rigidly outward from the skull, trunk drawn inward and curled beneath the head, repeated dust throwing from the ground surface, and a short bluff advance that stopped and reset. He began reversing his vehicle immediately. The vehicle positioned directly behind had stopped too closely, leaving insufficient room to complete the maneuver. Venter read every signal correctly. He made the right call. The vehicle behind him is the reason that call could not be executed. The female performed a mock charge, stopping approximately 10 meters from the front of the vehicle line. Several tourists in adjacent vehicles responded to the halt by continuing to photograph and film at elevated volume and movement, misreading the stop as hesitation rather than as a terminal point before a committed charge. African bush elephants are the largest land animals on Earth. Adult females in breeding herds routinely exceed 7,000 pounds, and despite the assumptions their size generates, they are capable of accelerating to speeds that no safari vehicle can outpace across the short distances typical of track encounters. The behavioral assessment of mock versus committed charge is one of the most consequential decisions a guide makes in the field, and the margin for error is narrow. A mock charge typically involves raised trunk, flared ears, and a deceleration to a stop at distance. A committed charge involves a lowered head, tucked trunk, and sustained acceleration with no stop. The transition between these two behaviors does not announce itself. It occurs within a single movement sequence. Females with calves are consistently the most dangerous individual elephants in any encounter, and their threshold for transitioning from mock to committed attack compresses significantly when their established movement corridor is blocked by vehicles positioned on multiple sides with no clear exit. The female committed to a full charge from the 10-meter position, She accelerated directly into the vehicle line without stopping and struck the front quarter panel of Venter's vehicle with sufficient force to push it partially into the drainage ditch beside the track. The vehicle sustained significant structural damage. Carter and Meyer sustained minor injuries from the impact. Venter received a laceration consistent with contact against the interior of the vehicle during the collision. Emergency radio contact was established immediately, and support reached the location within approximately 40 minutes. The investigation confirmed that the incident resulted from a combination of vehicle clustering on a narrow single-lane corridor, inadequate spacing maintained by the vehicle to the rear that prevented the guide from executing a safe withdrawal, and continued high-movement behavior by tourists in adjacent vehicles during an active threat display by the herd's lead female. Venter was assessed as having responded correctly throughout the sequence and was cleared of any negligence. The park authority issued updated operational guidelines covering minimum vehicle spacing requirements in active elephant movement corridors following the conclusion of the investigation. He did everything right and still ended up in a ditch. That is the part of this story I find most difficult to set down. The elephant gave warnings, it displayed, it bluffed, it announced itself at every stage. The next animal gave nothing. It was August 7th, 2012. The winter dry season in a private game reserve in the South African Lowveld had reduced the bush to minimal leaf cover, and the ravine systems cutting through the reserve's terrain were dense with dry brush, dead vegetation, and deep shadow well before sundown. The air that evening carried the sharp cold that descends over the Lowveld rapidly after the sun drops, and visibility inside the ravine system had already deteriorated significantly by the time the crew's vehicle reached the area. The dry channel floor and its surrounding brush provided almost no sightline beyond a few meters in any direction. Lowveld cold arrives without warning. One moment, the light is workable. Then the temperature drops, the shadows flatten, and everything inside the ravine becomes the same shade of dark. Trevor Hale was a 55-year-old documentary filmmaker from the United Kingdom, whose career had spanned over 2 decades of natural history production work across multiple continents. He had built a professional reputation on close-range wildlife footage and approached each assignment with the specific goal of obtaining sequences that standard game drive access could not produce. His wife, Nina Hale, 50, worked as his producer and had collaborated with him across the full span of his professional career. The tracker assigned to their vehicle, Sifo Dlamini, 39, had worked in the reserve for over a decade and held detailed knowledge of the terrain, the resident animal territories, and the individual behavioral patterns of the leopards, monitored within the reserve's boundaries. He carried a professional field guide qualification and was certified to operate in areas with dangerous game. The crew had been tracking a mature male leopard that had made a kill on an impala and was progressively dragging the carcass deeper into a dry ravine system as vultures gathered on exposed branches above, and hyenas tested the perimeter from the bush margins. As daylight faded and the available light quality for filming degraded, Trevor indicated that losing the sequence entirely was a significant concern for the production. The tracker advised that visibility inside the ravine had dropped to a point where the leopard's exact position could not be reliably established from the vehicle, and that continuing to approach the area without knowing where the animal was relative to the carcass presented a serious and specific risk. The vehicle remained at its position above the ravine edge. 2 decades of production work. He had been in situations like this before and come away with the footage. I think that history is part of what made the next decision feel reasonable to him. While adjusting a camera angle at the side of the vehicle, Trevor moved several meters downslope into thicker brush without the movement being registered as a significant departure by the tracker or the rest of the crew. By the time his positioning was fully apparent, he had placed himself between the leopard's location beside the carcass and the natural exit route the animal would use to leave the ravine. Leopards are pound for pound among the most powerful large predators on the African continent. Adult males can reach 200 pounds and are capable of hauling carcasses significantly heavier than themselves vertically up tree trunks. They are ambush hunters by design, built for explosive short-range contact rather than sustained pursuit, and their muscular density relative to body size exceeds that of any other large African cat. When feeding on a kill, a leopard becomes intensely defensive of the carcass, and any perceived threat at close range triggers an immediate short charge response. Before the animal withdraws, the geometry of most leopard attacks at kill sites follows a consistent pattern. A human who inadvertently positions between a feeding leopard and its exit route removes the animal's option to retreat and collapses its defensive threshold entirely. At distances under 5 meters, a leopard's attack is complete before any human reflex sequence can initiate a protective response. That geometry is what I keep returning to. Trevor did not approach the leopard. He accidentally removed its ability to leave. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction matters. The leopard, positioned less than 5 meters from Trevor beside the carcass, launched a short-range defensive ambush charge. The animal struck Trevor and drove him backward down the slope before retreating once the tracker and the rest of the crew advanced together toward the disturbance. The leopard did not re-engage. Trevor sustained significant lacerations to the upper body and shoulder, and a serious wound consistent with the initial contact impact. He was extracted to the vehicle and transported under emergency protocols to the nearest available medical response point. The investigation determined that Trevor had moved beyond the vehicle's immediate perimeter without the tracker's knowledge and had positioned himself at the kill site's critical choke point during deteriorating light conditions. Dlamini was cleared of any negligence. The reserve suspended operations in the affected section for a period of 48 hours and issued updated crew protocols establishing minimum required distances from active kill sites after sundown, applicable to all production teams operating within the reserve. Trevor moved toward the animal. Aaron never moved at all. The water moved him. It was January 14th, 2018. The summer rainy season had filled the side channels of a major river system in Zimbabwe to their maximum, pushing water across previously dry sandbanks and flooding the reed beds along the margins to depths that obscured the bottom completely. The current through the narrow seasonal channel ran slow and steady, and the flooded vegetation on both banks reduced visibility to only a few meters in any direction. The air was humid and heavy with the particular thick warmth that settles over lowland river systems in the wet months, and the water surface carried the opaque brown-green color that makes depth and underwater movement entirely unreadable from above. Canoe safari operators describe flooded seasonal channels as a different river entirely. Same water, different rules. Aaron Blake was a 34-year-old logistics manager from Australia who had organized a river-based safari specifically for the canoe component rather than the standard game drive experience. His partner, Helen Blake, 32, had joined the trip on her first African safari. Their guide, Tendai Moyo, 45, had operated canoe safaris on the river for over 12 years and held professional guide qualifications for water-based operations in areas with both hippopotamus and crocodile populations. He was regarded within the regional operator community as one of the more experienced practitioners on that particular river system. The group entered a flooded side channel during the morning session. Tall reed walls lined both margins, and submerged sandbanks forced the canoes away from the shallower edges and into the deeper central current, the reverse of the configuration a guide prefers when moving through a section of river with possible hippopotamus presence. A short distance into the channel, the guide identified clear indicators of animals nearby. Fresh dung sprayed across the reed stems at the waterline, and a pattern of bubbling surface disturbance ahead consistent with a pod resting on the channel floor in the deeper central section. He directed the group immediately toward the shallower margins where hippos have significantly less maneuvering capacity. The current in the central channel was moving faster than the pace at which the group could reposition, and it carried Aaron and Helen's canoe downstream ahead of the others, placing it between the pod's resting location and the deeper water to which hippos retreat when pressured. The precise configuration guides are trained to identify and avoid above any other. The guide saw it happening. He gave the instruction. The current was faster than the instruction could travel. Hippopotamuses are responsible for a substantial number of human fatalities annually across sub-Saharan Africa and are consistently placed among the continent's most dangerous animals despite their entirely herbivorous diet. Adult bulls can exceed 3,500 pounds and move through water with a speed and directional precision that bears no resemblance to their appearance on land. Their jaws can open to nearly 150 degrees, and the canine teeth of dominant males can reach lengths sufficient to punch through the bottom of any non-reinforced watercraft. Hippos do not attack in water as a predatory behavior. They attack as a territorial response to a perceived blockage of their movement or escape route. When a canoe or swimmer drifts into the space between a resting hippo and deeper water, the animal's instinct is to clear the obstruction with the full force available to it, and the response is immediate and vertical. Canoes provide no structural resistance to an upward impact from an animal of this mass. I want to be precise about something here. Nobody made a mistake. The current made a decision, and the channel enforced it. A large bull surfaced directly beneath the rear section of the canoe. The impact capsized it instantly and threw both occupants into the channel. The animal continued engaging below the surface, biting repeatedly while the guide repositioned to regroup the scattered group and direct the remaining canoes toward exposed sandbank areas where the shallow water significantly reduced the hippo's ability to maneuver. Aaron sustained deep bite wounds to his lower back and legs. Helen sustained lacerations and injuries consistent with the capsize impact. Both were recovered from the water and transported by the guide to a vehicle access point where emergency radio contact had been established from the moment the capsize occurred. The investigation confirmed that the capsize resulted from the current carrying the canoe out of its intended position during the guide's repositioning response, rather than from a deliberate decision by any party to enter the area where the pod was resting. Moyo was assessed as having correctly identified the risk and initiated the appropriate response before the incident occurred. The investigation produced updated operational guidance for canoe safari operators in the region, specifically addressing minimum channel width requirements and mandatory current assessment procedures for flooded seasonal routes during the wet season. The regulation that followed was precise because the incident was precise. That is how these documents get written, carefully and too late.